So much of the work that I'm going to talk about today was done and continues to be done in support of the strategy for wolf conservation in Ontario. And I won't reread the goal, but you can see it on the screen there. Basically, the strategy recognizes that wolves offer have a value of themselves, but also offer multiple benefits to users from multiple different groups. And we're trying to recognize that and ensure that we have sustainable and healthy wolf populations into the future. Now, there are a number of research needs then that are required to make sure that we're actually meeting the goals of the strategy. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. One of the first things that needs to be done, and this is something that's more important and perhaps more problematic in Ontario than it is in many jurisdictions, and that is dealing with taxonomy or genetics. We've got, as you'll see in a couple slides, multiple wolf species in this province. We also have fairly extensive hybridization between coyotes and eastern wolves, and between eastern wolves and gray wolves in the north, and we've got a really complicated situation when it comes to taxonomy relative to other jurisdictions. Another thing that we're often asked is how many, and certainly in recent years that's been coming up again and again. How many wolves do we have? Do we really have as many as we think? Have numbers increased as much as we think they have in these areas? So that's something we've been looking at. Another part that gets a bit of a bullet on its own is this issue of emerging issues. And I know we heard Mike mention this morning the issue of the harvest ban around Algonquin. And that was an important emerging issue that we did some work on and were able to provide some science advice on. And I'll certainly speak to that. Another one was the issue of management of, or harvesting, I guess, of wolves and coyotes in northern Ontario. So as everybody in this room knows, if you live in southern Ontario, you can hunt coyotes year-round if you have a small game license. You don't need a tag, and there's essentially no closed season. If you live in the northeast or the northwest and you want to hunt coyotes, then you have to buy a wolf seal to do so, and I'll talk a bit about some of the work we've done around that as well. And then, again, I mentioned that we have several wolf species in the province, and we've got wolves across the majority of the landmass of this province. So we felt it important to just gain some baseline information on these animals in different areas of the province to get a better understanding of how our wolf populations are doing. So are there any conservation issues related to wolves in any areas of the province, or are populations fairly healthy and robust across the province? And finally, and this is a point I would say last but not least, because I know this is a topic that's near and dear to the hearts of many folks here today, is determining relationships with prey species. And today I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking about wolf and coyote predation on deer and wolf predation on moose, and talk about some of the work that we've done there and some of the work that remains to be done. So I mentioned this before, but we've got a wide variety of animals across this province. They come in a number of different sizes and shapes. And regardless of that, most people I talk to call them all wolves. So we've been doing work on coyotes in Prince Edward County this year, and just about every landowner that I've talked to in the county talks about the wolves. And we can talk in a minute about whether or not there's actually wolves there. To get at this idea or to get at the question, that is, of what animals do we have and where do they occur in the landscape, we've partnered with the Natural Resources DNA Profiling and Forensics Center at Trent University. And on this map, all those dots represent genetic samples of either a wolf or coyote that we've collected from somewhere in the Great Lakes region. And you don't need to count every dot, but the point is that we have sampled extensively across many different jurisdictions to get an idea of not only what our animals are in Ontario and where they live, but also how they relate to the wolves and coyotes that live in neighboring jurisdictions. Now, we're often asked to put maps up and say, show lines between different populations, and I always hate doing that because the reality is that there are no hard lines, and there isn't a line anywhere where species A ends and species B begins, and there's no overlap. There's overlap amongst all these animals. So this is to be taken, this map is to be taken as in a general sense and with a bit of a grain of salt. But basically the take-home message here is that In yellow, across most of southern Ontario, pretty much all of the wild free-ranging canids out there are what we call eastern coyotes. And as you'll see in a minute, the eastern coyote is essentially a coyote, but it does have some wolf DNA. Coyotes are not native to Ontario. The first coyote in southern Ontario was confirmed, was killed in 1919 in Lambton. They didn't become common in Ontario, I think, until the late 30s into the 40s. And then, of course, they spread more or less like wildfire after that. And as was mentioned this morning, when coyotes arrived in Ontario, we actually had a bounty on wolves and coyotes in the province already when the coyotes showed up here. And coyotes went on to multiply greatly and expand and colonize the entire province, despite the fact that there was a bounty in place when they got here. And I made this comment to someone earlier, but I've often heard, well, the bounty was probably not lucrative enough or not enough money to make it worth anyone's time. And I can tell you, if you go back through the old file reports, nothing could be further from the truth. It was extremely lucrative compared to money that you hear talked about in other jurisdictions today. In a slightly different context, I mentioned that in Prince Edward County, there were wolves early in the 20th century, and there was a bounty on those wolves. And I'll say this now, and it's been said before, but I'm aware of no record anywhere where a bounty on coyotes has been able to either eliminate or greatly reduce coyote numbers. Wolves are a different story, and wolves have been eliminated from many areas through things like bounties, and we've done that, but not with coyotes. Anyway, in 1920, if you could take a wolf in Prince Edward County, between the provincial monies and the municipal money, and then there was a third group throwing in some money as well, I believe you got $115 per wolf in 1920 in Prince Edward County. That's a bit of an extreme, but there are lots of other records from that time when you could get $30, $40 through combined incentives for killing a wolf or coyote. So we certainly had a bounty, and we certainly tried hard to make it work, and it certainly did not work. Coyotes occur across pretty much all the province, but when you get into the northern reaches, so up in the northeast, they're largely restricted to the agricultural areas and around sort of settled areas, and the same goes through the northwest. In green, and this is something we're going to talk about a bit more later on, around Algonquin Park we have the eastern wolf. The eastern wolf is what we call a New World wolf. It evolved here in North America, as did coyotes. And it's a smaller wolf relative to the big gray wolf that we often see on the Discovery Channel. And it is not all that common. They're very common in Algonquin. You find some outside the park, as seen by the gray dots here. You can find them down into the Kawartha Highlands areas, some. You can find them through Parry Sound District. You can even find the odd one up into the northeast. But when you get outside that sort of green dotted area, most of the wild wolves or coyotes in the landscape they have some eastern wolf DNA in them, but they're primarily something other than an eastern wolf per se. And having said that, I would also add that because of the hybridization between eastern wolves and coyotes and eastern wolves and gray wolves, there are probably no pure eastern wolves, not only in Ontario but anywhere in the world. They just don't exist anymore because of the past hybridization. But I would say that the least hybridized and sort of the closest living resemblant to what was once the historic eastern wolf is still found in and around Algonquin. So if we start up in the top left of this screen, you see an image of a typical gray wolf, again the largest of our wolf species. We've been doing some work in the boreal forest in northern Ontario. We have caught and put radio collars on wolves up to 140 pounds in that area. Nothing approaching anywhere near that size in this neck of the woods. The western coyote on the other end of the spectrum is a very small animal. We don't have western coyotes in Ontario. When coyotes entered the province, again in the early 20th century, they hybridized with our remnant eastern wolf population. And today, when we sample coyotes from anywhere in the province, they all show evidence of past hybridization with eastern wolves. So we don't have the prairie coyote in Ontario. We have a larger coyote, which is on the far right of the screen, the eastern coyote. And as I mentioned, that's a hybrid animal between the western coyote and the eastern wolf. Although we call it a hybrid, its DNA, its genetic makeup is predominantly coyote. It's more coyote than wolf, but it is a hybrid animal. So I don't want to spend too much time on the genetics. There's a lot of other interesting things to move on to, but I'll just wrap it up with a couple slides. Eastern wolves and coyotes hybridized when coyotes entered Ontario. They formed the eastern coyote, which is now the coyote that we have in this province, and the coyote that went on to colonize the northeastern United States and eastern Canada. Eastern wolves can also hybridize with gray wolves in the north, and the most common wolf in Ontario across the northeast and the northwest is being commonly referred to as the Great Lakes wolf. It is an eastern wolf gray wolf hybrid. Again, it's more gray wolf than eastern wolf, but it is a hybrid animal. It's not pure. And that is the animal that's found throughout the Great Lakes states. So this is a bit of a challenge for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in that they really don't have pure gray wolves in Minnesota and Michigan or Wisconsin. Rather, they have this Great Lakes wolf, which, again, mostly a gray wolf, but it is a bit of a hybrid with eastern wolves. When you move into northern Ontario, you get up into the far north, so we're talking about above the area of the undertaking, above the northern limit of forestry. You do start to get into some unhybridized pure gray wolves, but they are relatively uncommon in the province, and most of the large wolves in the north are hybrids of one type or another. But we do find some old world gray wolves that are not hybrids. Okay, so we'll move on to estimating wolf abundance and how we do that. But first I'll mention the strategy we adopted there. And from the outset, we knew that it was going to be completely impractical and completely not affordable to go out and census or count wolves on a regular basis directly. The surveys are intense and are quite expensive. The same rationale holds for why we don't I can't stand up here today and tell you exactly how many coyotes we have in most areas of the province, simply because if we were going to go out and design a study that would give you a fairly precise and accurate estimate of coyote numbers across southern Ontario, I can tell you that it would cost millions and millions of dollars, and I'm not sure that anybody would argue that that would be money well spent. Anyway, so the strategy with wolves was to initially develop some techniques to come up with a one-time empirical or data-based estimate of wolf abundance in representative areas across Ontario, and then while doing that, also develop an index or something that will measure changes in the trend in abundance of wolves over time. And then periodically we might go back and actually resurvey wolves to sort of calibrate our index, but this index will primarily be what we use to indicate whether wolf numbers are going up or down in particular areas over time. Won't get into all the details here, but I'll tell you two things. One, along the southern edge of Wolf Range, whether you're in eastern Ontario, so across the Algonquin Highlands, deer management area, or whether you're up in the northwest, where it's labeled Zone 3, those two areas have the highest wolf densities in the province, and in both areas you're roughly in the ballpark of about 3 wolves per 100 square kilometers. As you move north, up above the tree line and get into above again the northern limit of forestry, both in the northwest and in the northeast, you will see about a 10-fold or an order of magnitude drop in wolf density. And that's largely related to declines in prey biomass along that gradient. We see that in the northwest and we see that in the northeast. So more evidence adding to the already large body of evidence suggesting that wolf abundance is largely a function of the abundance of food out there, the abundance of prey biomass. If you sort of summarize this up, you get a provincial estimate for wolves in the neighborhood of about 8,000. Again, back to coyotes. We don't know how many coyotes there are, but I can tell you that there are certainly many more than 8,000. That's all I can say. Wolf population trends. You heard this from Mike talking about deer, and the same technique is used to index changes in both wolf and coyote numbers. So for wolves, there's a question on the moose hunter questionnaire. Did you see wolves? And there's enough moose hunters in the province that there's actually a fairly large amount of data there. As long as you don't try and look at it at a very fine scale, there's actually a lot of data there, and you can get some pretty robust data on trends in wolf abundance. And what we see when we look at that data is that the number of wolves seen per 100 day declines as you go from north to south, so that's what we would have expected. But also it shouldn't be a surprise that that number increased throughout most of the last 10 years. Now, I don't have here data from 2010, but it is available and I have seen it. And in all zones except for the southern zone, wolf numbers, the number of wolves sighted per moose hunter day actually did decline in 2010 across, on this map, zones 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 is stable. And when we look at similar data from the deer hunter questionnaires pertaining to coyotes across the south, we see that through, and that data isn't available yet for 2010, but it will be soon, but through 2009, coyote numbers continued to increase steadily through that period in some wildlife management units in some areas, but they did level out and in fact even start to decline in some wildlife management units beginning as early as 2008. And Prince Edward County actually is an example where the number of coyotes seen per deer hunter day in Prince Edward County actually peaked in 2008 and dropped after that. So now I'm going to talk about one of the emerging issues that I mentioned on the slide earlier, and this is the viability of wolves around Algonquin Park. And I don't have a lot of time here today, and I've got a lot of things I want to talk about, so I won't get too deep into the background. And I think most people here are well aware of the issue there, so we'll sum it up and say that in the 1990s, there was increasing public concern and a lot of debate regarding the long-term viability of wolves in Algonquin Park. And the major concern that was being sort of borne out in the media at that time was that wolves in Algonquin might be declining, largely due to hunting and trapping by people when the wolves followed migratory deer out of the park in the wintertime. That was the big issue that was being tossed around at the time. So in December of 2001, a harvest ban was put in place that prohibited hunting and trapping of wolves in these townships surrounding Algonquin Park. And basically, as soon as that harvest ban was put in place, a group that I was part of was tasked with designing and delivering a research program to determine whether or not this harvest ban was having an impact on the viability of wolves and basically whether or not this harvest ban was biologically justifiable. So we had 3 primary objectives, and I've already sort of touched on one, but I'll obviously touch on it a little more. And that was to look at the genetic distinctiveness of wolves in the park and compare that with animals from surrounding areas. The next objective was sort of the meat and potatoes of it. Did numbers go up after the ban was put in place? Did survival rates go up? Are pack sizes greater now? Are the indicators saying that the overall viability of wolves has been enhanced by having this harvest ban in place? And the last one is a bit of a sub-point. It's almost more like a 2B rather than 3, and that is that a competing hypothesis, even if wolves were declining in the park, it wasn't necessarily the case that the decline would have been due to hunting and trapping of wolves when they left the park in the winter. A competing hypothesis was that there was very poor pup survival amongst wolves in the park. And the reason we thought that might be possible was twofold. One, reports from howling surveys indicated that by the end of the summer or early fall, in many of the packs in the park, there seemed to be few pups, and in some cases no pups in some of the packs. And 2, the blood work that was done on animals that were handled in the park suggested a very high seroprevalence to canine parvovirus, which we know can be very devastating to dog pups and probably equally so to wolves. So those indicators suggested there might be an issue with pups there, and we better look at that as well. So I already mentioned the genetics. This story has changed a bit, and I'll back up 10 years or so and sort of walk you through to the present. Initially, when the first genetic work was done on wolves in the park, there was some suggestions made that this was a unique wolf species in Algonquin and that it was very different from animals outside the park, and that this eastern wolf that was found in the park was essentially the same as the red wolf, which is one of the most endangered mammals in the United States. So that was sort of the initial idea, and then we found, and around the time that the harvest ban issue was sort of just starting to play out, we found that eastern wolf DNA, there was parts of the eastern wolf genetic makeup that were found in wolves across a very broad band, extending basically from Manitoba into Quebec, and that you could find some eastern wolf DNA across that broad band, and that's true. But the big but that's sort of been borne out in more recent years is that if you want to find an animal that has all the sort of genetic makeup of a wolf in or around Algonquin, you're not finding those animals across that broad swatch. They're basically in a fairly restricted area that includes the park and the shield to the west, to the south, and into Quebec, into an unknown area. We don't know exactly how big, and that's something we're really scrambling to determine, but it's certainly, we do know that an Algonquin-type eastern wolf, or an animal that's very much like you would find in the park, is is quite rare in northeastern Ontario. I'll speak to that in a few minutes. And is exceptionally rare, in fact, almost completely absent from northwestern Ontario. So there are differences there. The points here, so the least hybridized of the eastern wolves, I guess, reside in the park. There are eastern wolves outside the park that are very, very similar or almost identical to the wolves in the park, but they're not the most common animal in those landscapes. So if we were to go and sample the genetics of a bunch of wild canids in the Kawartha Highlands signature site, we would find some animals there that are like eastern wolves, but we would also find many animals there that are essentially eastern coyotes. And the same would be through most of the Parry Sound district. So that's the genetic picture in a nutshell. In terms of densities, the harvest ban was put in place in late December of 2001. We did a helicopter survey in western Algonquin in February of 2002, and then we started collaring wolves later that summer and estimating their densities that way. And basically we found that for 5 years after the ban, there was really no change in density. Densities appeared to be fairly high, basically as soon as we could possibly measure them after the ban, and they stayed stable, so there was no increase in the abundance of wolves in the park following the ban. So I didn't get into all the slides on the survival, but I'll tell you this, that the first year after the harvest ban was put in place, survival rates of yearling and adult wolves spiked to a very high level in the 90s, 90% survival, extremely high for wolf population. By the second year after the ban was put in place, we saw an increase in natural mortality. Wolves started to kill each other. We saw wolves dying of strife. We saw some wolves starving, dying of disease, and survival rates started to creep down a little bit. Regardless of this increase in survival, though, we did not see an increase in either pack size or density of wolves in the park, and that was largely due to the fact that there was an increase in natural mortality, as I just said, and also that there was an increase in dispersal, so more wolves were leaving the park, and this is certainly something that probably a number of you in the room have voiced as a concern over the years, that there are wolves leaving Algonquin and showing up either on your trap line or in your camp area outside the park, and in many cases you're probably not overly pleased by that. So the bottom line is, in terms of densities, the densities appear to be stable since the ban. The number of wolves dying plus the number of wolves that were leaving the park were being offset by the number of wolves that were being recruited into the park population. So we had a fairly stable population. Now, if we were to draw a red line across there under point 4 and leave it there, you could say that from a purely numerical point of view, there is no obvious benefit or no need to have the harvest ban because, and I would say this, we've done the modeling, if there were no harvest ban around Algonquin, it's a nuisance to watermelon farmers. They do incredible damage to watermelons. Wolves are a little less adaptable, a little less diverse than coyotes, and we generally think of wolves as being what you'd call an obligate predator of ungulates. That means that they are bigger, they have higher energy requirements, they need a bigger package of food than, say, you can get from mice or lemmings. So we say wolves generally only live where they have access to some sort of large hoofed animal to eat. Also, another sort of generalization that sort of sets the stage here is that prey can be dangerous. And in the course of our radio tracking studies in different areas, we've had several examples of radio-collared wolves being killed, not just by moose, but by deer as well, either by antler goring or with hooves. So prey can be dangerous. And given that, if you're a wolf and you live in a territory that has both deer and moose, chances are you're going to pay a lot of attention to those deer and generally ignore those moose because it's safer. The same, and I'm not going to dwell on livestock, but the same sort of argument applies, or the sort of rationale applies to the issue of livestock depredation, in that if you're a wolf or a coyote and you're out there feeding, you're constantly, even if subconsciously, asking yourself, what's the best way to get the most calories in my stomach with the least amount of danger to myself, the least amount of risk? And unfortunately, the answer to that question often is sheep or livestock. And so when we try and mitigate livestock depredation, and I'm not going to dwell on that, what we try and do is tip that balance. So you're trying to make it either more dangerous or more difficult or less energetically favorable for a wild coyote or a wild wolf to prey on livestock than it would be for that animal to prey on a wild prey. So one of the ways that we've looked at predation on both deer and moose by wolves and coyotes is through the use of GPS tracking collars. And I'm sure that basically everybody in the room is using handheld GPS in your regular hunting and fishing activities, so I don't need to get into that. Other than to say that a GPS collar basically has a GPS unit in the collar, and as the wolf or coyote moves across the landscape, it's repeatedly taking locations and recording precise locations where that animal has been. And these collars today can store thousands and thousands of these locations as the animal goes about its business. We can retrieve that data. I've got collars now, the coyotes in Prince Edward County. Some of those collars send the data to my desk via cell phones. And so I got a little modem sitting on my shelf, and beep, 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 and the locations are coming in real time from the coyotes moving around the county. Up north with wolves, it's through satellites. The coyotes transmit data to the satellite, and the satellite company emails it to my desk. So if we logged on now, I could tell you, as we speak, where wolves are moving in Pickle Lake. So the way you take that data, though, and investigate predation on big things is that picture a wolf or a coyote moving across the landscape. And if a wolf or a coyote is moving, they're probably feeding or hunting at least, or they're alert for food. If the wolf kills a deer, it's going to stop, it's going to fill its belly on that deer, and it's probably going to move a very short distance away, plop down in the snow, and digest for a few hours. The result of that is a big clump or a cluster of locations in one spot, and that's what we see here in this map. So October 12th, 8:30 a.m., the wolf comes into this spot. Then for the next almost 9 hours or so, 9.5 hours, it never moves more than a 50-meter radius from that spot. So the obvious question is, did it just lay down and have a nap there, or did it kill something at that spot? So to find out, you get lots of volunteers that have good boots and aren't afraid to walk. You load a big list of waypoints into a GPS, and you send them out into the bush, and you investigate many, many, many of these sites. Some of these sites will just be bedding sites. They didn't eat anything. But some of these sites will be like this. If we get there fresh in the wintertime when the snow is still good, you can interpret things like signs of the chase. You can say how many coyotes or wolves were involved, was there much of a struggle, and so on. But even if you don't get there till the spring, sometimes several months later, there are enough remains left to determine, what happened to that site. And if it was a moose in trees like this, you can fairly easily determine, even months later, whether or not that moose was killed by the wolves or whether it was found dead and scavenged. And you can interpret that largely based on the fact that if the moose was killed there will be a lot of broken trees and broken branches. There will be moose hair and perhaps even wolf hair speared on branches up around your head level. And that will persist for quite a long time. So in Algonquin specifically, we investigated in 2006 and 2007, we investigated almost 1,500 of these potential kill sites. Of those, we found 372 kills, slightly more deer than moose. Those are sort of the raw numbers. I'm going to put this into context in the next series of slides. One of the big generalizations that I'm going to make is that both among study areas and within study areas, there is a tremendous amount of variability in the killing rate or the predation rate by individual wolf packs. So the wolf pack living in this chunk of land might have very similar conditions to the wolf pack living over where Terry's sitting, but for various reasons, the predation that they enact can be very, very different. I'm going to show you that in a few slides here. First, though, one thing that I know myself and other biologists have been criticized for is people will say, well, biologists tell me that wolves only kill the old or the sick moose and that they don't kill prime-age moose, and that's BS. I don't believe it. And you're right. If you say that they only kill sick or old moose and they don't kill prime-age moose or they don't kill prime-age deer, you're lying. But I can say that they kill a disproportionate number of sick or old moose, and that's what this data shows. So in the red bars, or the purple bars here, we have data on the age distribution of the living moose population, both in the west end of Algonquin Park and in Wildlife Management Unit 49. And we got that because we radio collared a large number of moose, and when we collared the moose, we captured them, we pulled a tooth out and sectioned the tooth for aging. So amongst the living population of moose, most of the moose were in the 2 to 5 or 6 age range. That's the high red bars here. So most of the moose, that's the biggest portion of the population, Yet the blue bars are the age distribution of the wolf kills. You can see that that age class is relatively underrepresented in the kill sample. On the other hand, when you get out into the moose that are 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, they represent a fairly small portion of the living moose population. They're quite rare in the population. There aren't a lot of older moose, yet they're well overrepresented by these higher blue bars in the kills. So a disproportionate number of the moose kills, at least in that area of the province, are older than the average population. And when you investigate the remains of those moose, you'll often find that they have split teeth or dental problems, necrosis of the gums. They're in poor shape. They're not healthy moose. Now again, that's not to say that wolves don't kill some prime age moose and some moose that are healthy, because they do, and that's shown here. They kill some, they just don't kill them at the same rate that they occur in the population. So another thing that's emerged from this work, and emerged from work done in other areas, is that if you're a wolf or a coyote, your ability to kill a deer or to kill a moose is largely influenced by your body size. And coyotes are smaller than eastern wolves. Eastern wolves are smaller than this Great Lakes wolf. That's a wolf-coyote hybrid. And these are, sorry, that's a Great Lakes eastern wolf hybrid, this wolf that's most common across the northeast and the northwest. And those wolves are even smaller than the unhybridized gray wolves that we have preying on caribou and moose up in the far north areas of the province. That influences their ability. And it actually influences it substantially. So I think I present this number later on, but basically a pack of eastern coyotes running around Peterborough wouldn't even be a quarter as effective at killing deer as a pack of wolves, of the same number of wolves, running just outside Algonquin Park. They wouldn't even be a quarter good at it. So you see kills. I had, I think that first slide was a deer kill that coyotes made on my property on Family Day this year. I got up with the kids. We went down the driveway. There was coyote tracks everywhere. We went a little further. There was a dead doe laying beside our driveway. And 2 coyotes took it down close to the driveway, and we put trail cameras up. We got a whack of pictures. Anyway, they killed that. You see that thing, and you think, oh, the coyotes are killing all the deer. Well, they are killing some deer, but they're not very good at it. And that same pack or pair of coyotes that killed that deer probably only killed 5 or 6 deer this entire winter, whereas some of the packs of wolves further north in areas with good abundance of deer could kill easily 40 deer in a winter. So these red areas just show different areas where we've had or have radio collars on wolves for different purposes. And I just show you that now because I need to come back to this in a minute. And I'll come back to it in the context of this variation in kill rates among study areas. But I mentioned before that there can be a lot of variation in predation rates even amongst neighboring packs. So here, going back to Algonquin, the packs territories, and I didn't say this earlier, but I'm assuming most people know, both wolves and coyotes are territorial. So a family group or a pack of wolves or a pack of coyotes, they live in an exclusive chunk of land, and there aren't any other breeding or territorial groups of animals on that chunk of land. There's a big layer of single animals, transients, roaming around everywhere, waiting for an opportunity to join a pack, and they don't respect the territory boundaries. But the resident territorial animals tend to live in exclusive areas, as shown here. Anyway, some packs focus their hunting activities on moose. Some down towards the Round Lake Deer Yard focused almost exclusively on deer. Other packs made use of both prey. In some cases, there was no obvious difference as to why those packs were behaving the way they were and feeding on what they were. Everything that we could measure on the ground seemed similar amongst those areas, yet they were showing very different foraging habits. And that's indicated here. So here we have the number either of deer or moose killed per month by individual packs of wolves that we were studying in Algonquin. So on the left end of the graph, you can see some packs that foraged almost exclusively on deer were killing in the neighborhood of, say, 7 to 10 or so deer a month in the wintertime. No moose. Those packs were focusing exclusively on deer. On the other end of the spectrum, in the same system in Algonquin, you had some packs that were foraging almost exclusively on moose, making basically no use of deer. And then in the middle, you had a number of packs that were making some use of both. The other interesting thing, though, is that some packs that were followed for 2 years, living in the same territory on 2 consecutive winters, had very different foraging habits from one winter to the next. So in this winter, they focused mostly on deer. Next year, they focused more on moose. You know, why is that? It's an interesting question, and it seems that learning or personality, individual personality seems to be a factor there. But another factor that can contribute to these differences that we see in predation rates among study areas and among packs within a study area is winter severity. Mike mentioned this before, and here's some information on it. A colleague of mine, Glenn Delgidis, conducted a long-term survival study of white-tailed deer in Minnesota, and over the course of the study, they had a lot of variation in winter severity. During years when winter severity was very mild, wolves took as little as 3% of the deer that were entering the winter. In the same study area, same conditions, except for very severe winter conditions, so not same conditions, wolves would take about 23% of the deer entering. So over a 7-fold difference in predation rate, largely due just to differences in winter severity. So it's very important. The other interesting thing, though, is that during the very worst winter, when wolves killed 23% of the deer that went into the winter, almost an equal number of deer died of starvation and malnutrition. They weren't killed by wolves. So overall, only about 55% of the deer survived that winter. 45% of the deer that entered that winter died. About half of that 45% were killed by wolves. The other half just starved. So winter severity, as winter progresses and winter severity increases, prey get more vulnerable. They're getting skinnier, they're getting weaker, it's harder to move around in the snow. As that happens in an area like Algonquin, we see wolves using proportionately more moose and less deer, and that's all it shows here. The blue graph is it showing an increase in the use of moose as winter goes from early to late, and a decrease in the use of deer as winter goes from early to late. So from this, I would summarize by saying the kill rate, so the rate at which either a wolf or a coyote pack can kill deer or moose, is strongly a function of the amount of that prey that's on the landscape, also winter severity, and predator body size. Those three things seem to be the big three that really dictate how much of a prey population is being taken out by either wolves or coyotes on the landscape. But there's very high variation in these predation rates within and among areas. I didn't show the data up there, but in Timmins, in the Horwood Lake area west of Timmins, we looked at wolf predation on moose. And again, with neighboring packs there, depending on the pack, wolves were taking between 3 and 10% of the non-calf moose per year. But that variation, why was this one only taking 3% and this one up to 10%, was very hard to explain. It wasn't obvious what was causing those differences. And I mentioned this, coyotes, despite what a lot of people think, they're not nearly as effective a predator of adult deer as a wolf. They're just not big enough. They can kill some deer, but they're just not great at it. But coyotes do exist. They do live on the landscape at a much higher density than wolves. So, and we know they are decent predators of fawns. So the extent of coyote predation on fawns, deer fawns, remains a big unknown, and it might be one area where coyotes could potentially have a impact on deer populations. And this is something we hope to look at in the coming years. So I'm going to just take a couple slides and talk about moose calves now. I know folks are interested in moose. We tagged 87 moose calves in the west end of Algonquin Park and in Wildlife Management Unit 49 between 2007 and 2009. And we're really interested in contrasting the west end of the park, where there was no human harvest of moose, with 49, where we still had basically an over-the-counter system where any hunter could go in and purchase a calf tag over the counter. So we wanted to contrast the mortality patterns and the overall survivorship of calves in those two areas. There's the study areas. And overall, about 62% of the moose calves that were born during that study lived to see their first birthday. And that's good news. That's high survival. That's high moose calf survival. That means that the population, as Mike inferred earlier, is likely doing well and potentially growing. However, even though the survival rates were similar in Wildlife Management Unit 49 and in the west end of Algonquin, what was killing the calves, so how they got to that 62% survival, was very different in those two areas. Predation was very rare by wild predators, was very rare in Wildlife Management Unit 49, but quite common in Algonquin. And obviously hunting only occurred in 49. So the difference in predation was interesting. One, because the data that we had on bear abundance suggested that bear abundance was almost identical between the west end of Algonquin Park and Wildlife Management Unit 49. So if you have the same number of bears, why were they eating more calves in the park relative to in 49? And I talked to Marty Obard. I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with Marty, our bear research scientist. The only thing we could come up with was that if the abundance was the same, the only real difference maybe had to do with the age structure and the sex ratio of the bears. Given that bears were hunted in 49, you would expect that they would have a more female-biased sex ratio than the bears in the park, and probably a younger age ratio in 49 compared to the park where the bears aren't hunted. And we do know from work on bears that older male bears tend to be better predators than other bears, so that may explain the difference. We're not that's purely a hypothesis, but we think that might be it. The wolf predation in the system seemed to be largely a non-issue. As I mentioned earlier, most of the quote-unquote wolves in Wildlife Management Unit 49 and across the Parry Sound District are wolf-coyote hybrids. They're not very big animals. They do not seem to be effective predators of moose. This isn't about hunting, but I'll just mention it briefly. So in 49, about 50% of the Wildlife Management Unit is Crown land. It's got pretty good access throughout a lot of that unit, and during the time of the study, any hunter could go in and purchase a calf tag over the counter. Despite all that, the annual mortality rate of moose calves attributable to hunting was about 16%. So hunting was not having a huge impact on calf recruitment, and overall calf survival was still about 62%. So the levels of hunting in 49 did not seem to be excessive when we did the study. So I've only got 2 slides left. I'm going to talk just briefly about the coyote work. This year we launched a coyote study in Prince Edward County. We're interested in a few things. One, we just wanted to get some baseline information on coyote densities, on their social structure, just some of the stuff that we know about wolves but didn't know about coyotes in Ontario. And also we're interested in livestock depredation. And ultimately we'd like to set up some experiments and actually test different ways of preventing and different ways of dealing with, once it happens, livestock depredation and basically stopping it. And to do that, it's going to be difficult because we're going to need to have areas where nothing is done. And we're going to have to compare the areas where nothing is done with areas where different things are done. And it's going to be pretty hard to convince people to do nothing and let depredation occur. But to really learn from it, I think that's going to be necessary. Also, in the next slide, I'm going to talk about some deer work that we're starting. As part of that deer work, we're also interested in radio tagging and monitoring coyotes in the Marlborough Forest south of Ottawa. And as part of that study, we will focus on looking at the use of deer by those coyotes. So are those coyotes preying on deer very much? And we'll get into that. So we started a deer study in the Marlborough Forest south of Ottawa in January, started radio tagging deer. The study is really focused on looking at the effects of sort of landscape pattern and access, the influence of that on hunting, and with the goal being to sort of comment on the ability of hunting to drive deer populations. So basically, if you have a landscape where there's a lot of private land or a lot of sort of parkland where you can hunt, there's got to be a threshold where no amount of hunting on the lands you can hunt will be enough to sort of cause, say, a population reduction across a broader landscape. And we'd like to look at those sort of movement patterns and those spatial patterns and try and get a better handle on the conditions when those kinds of things are likely to occur. But we are, as we did with the moose calves, we're going to focus on fawn predation as well. And so we're putting these vaginal implant transmitters in the adult female deer that we're catching. These things sit up against the cervix. When the doe has a fawn in June, this transmitter pops out. It has a temperature-sensitive switch on it that tells us that the doe has had a fawn and also tells us where the fawn was dropped, so we can basically track the signal in and hopefully find the fawn, collar these newborn fawns. This year will be a pilot year. We don't have a lot of does with these implants in them, so we'll just sort of get the kinks out of the system. But by next year, we hope to be tagging up to 60 fawns a season, and that will be a way to really determine what the extent of coyote predation on deer fawns, at least in that environment, is. I will say this anecdotally, that I hear from talking to hunters just about everywhere, people saying there are no fawns left, there are no fawns left, there are no fawns left. And when we started trapping deer this winter in the Marlborough Forest, pretty much all we were catching were fawns. And given the fawns are hungrier than the adults and a little more likely to go into the traps, but probably 15 of the first 20 deer we caught in there were fawns. So, and most of the does that we were seeing in our daily travels had either one or twin fawns. So in that area at least, the fawns seem to be doing pretty well at the moment. So that was a bit of a quick overview of some of the research we're doing. And at this time, if there's time left, I'd be really happy to answer any questions.
Unfortunately, folks,